Space Marine should not be able to stand inside a Chaos relic for that long, and yet there he was, unchanged, unmoved, standing in the middle of something that should have been tearing him apart. Titus had been in close contact with the corrupting force the Imperium calls Chaos for hours, and every model the Adeptus Astartes had built across 10,000 years said his mind should have started to drift, his body should have started to change, and his command should have started to fail. None of those things were happening. Across the galaxy, a sanctioned psyker logged the absence of expected signs, and the note that came back was short. It said the warrior was clean. Clean is not the word the Imperium uses when it is satisfied. Clean is the word the Imperium uses when it does not know what it is looking at, and that note traveled higher up the chain than the Ordo's reach on Graia could account for. By the time the Ultramarines Second Company secured the Forge World, an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus was already on his way. His subject had a name, and the name was Titus. What followed would take more than a century to resolve. Events on Graia are shown in the 2011 game Warhammer 40k Space Marine. An orc warlord was bearing down on a Forge world that produced advanced war machines for the wider state, and the Ultramarines were the only force in range. Titus led the intervention from the front, and by the end of the fight, the orcs were broken and the facility held. By every standard the chapter applied, the campaign was a clean success, and the record should have closed there. It did not. Beneath the orc assault, a second operation surfaced during the fighting. A warband of corrupted Astartes, former warriors who had fallen to the ruinous powers in centuries past, had moved onto the planet for their own purposes. They were after a relic linked to the corrupting force the Imperium calls Chaos. The artifact was already active, and its influence was prolonged. Titus came into close contact with that influence, and he did something no one expected. Standing near the Immaterium, which is the parallel reality that force reaches into the material world from, and Astartes is supposed to show some visible sign of contact. Behavior, appearance, or command patterns should shift in ways a sanctioned psyker can detect, and Titus showed none of those signs. Watching him most closely was his brother Sidonus, who had fought side by side with him for years and knew the man's tells, and there were no tells. Their younger brother Leandros, a strict adherent to the Codex Astartes, noticed the same thing, but where Sidonus saw a mystery, Leandros saw a contradiction. The doctrine did not allow for what they were watching, and Leandros believed the doctrine was right. Every Astartes who has ever stood that close to Chaos has paid for it. Titus did not appear to have paid anything at all. Things escalated past the orc threat entirely from there. The leader of the Chaos warband approached Titus directly and offered him the single outcome, the corrupting force most values from any Space Marine, which is will and consent, power in exchange for corruption, offered as a reward. Titus refused without hesitation, and that refusal is what led to the arrest that followed. The offer was rejected, the relic was secured, the warband was destroyed, and Sidonus did not survive the engagement. The book Codex Chaos Space Marines lays out the pattern of corruption in plain terms. Contact leaves traces, longer contact leaves deeper traces, and resistance is supposed to carry a cost that a trained observer can detect. The novel series, The Horus Heresy, returns to this principle across many entries, and the conclusion is the same. The most dangerous warriors in that ancient war were not the ones who failed openly, but the ones who appeared to succeed in ways no one could fully account for. And Titus had succeeded in exactly that way. In the working logic of the Imperium, the warrior who resists too cleanly is the warrior to watch. As the Graia campaign closed, an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus arrived to take Titus into custody. Leandros had filed a formal concern. His report did not accuse Titus of corruption. It accused him of being unable to be explained, which, inside the Imperium, is a different kind of charge entirely. Titus did not resist the arrest. He went with the Inquisitor without protest, and that was the last anyone saw of him for a very long time. When the Inquisition takes a Space Marine into custody, the process that follows is laid out across several official sources, in direct and indirect terms. It is not a trial, and it is not an interrogation in the ordinary sense. It is tearing down. By the end of it, most subjects do not survive intact, and the ones who do come out are not the men who went in. Facing him first would have been psychic interrogation, and Astartes is built to resist pain at a biological level and trained against the ordinary techniques of formal questioning, which means he cannot be physically overcome in standard ways. Inside the book Dark Heresy, the Ordo's method is described directly. A sanctioned psyker, licensed by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, enters his mind directly, and the questioning takes place there. For an ordinary man, that approach is often fatal. For an Astartes, it is slower, harder, and more invasive, because the warrior's mind is built in layers, including conditioning, oath reinforcement, and automatic loyalties installed during the earliest training rites. Such a psyker cannot simply walk through those layers, so they must be removed one at a time. The same process is presented in indirect, but matching terms across the Ordo's training material. Removing those layers exposes the deepest memories, including the imprints laid down when the brother was still a new recruit. Before he became the warrior the chapter now knows, those foundations are what hold him together, and the psyker reaches them, reads them, and reports what he finds. What he finds with Titus is not the kind of thing that closes a case. It is the kind of thing that opens new ones. His conditioning is intact, the oaths are firm, the loyalties are clean, and the man underneath all those layers has nothing visibly wrong with him. That answer should have been the end of the investigation, but in the working logic of the Ordo, an Astartes whose mind comes apart cleanly under pressure is not less suspicious than one who breaks. He is more suspicious. By the end of the procedure, the man the Astartes used to be is somewhere on the floor of the chamber, and the Inquisition decides what gets put back. Driving the next stage was that exact logic. The soul reading goes deeper than the mind, into the imprint a soul leaves on the immaterium itself. Inside the book Codex Inquisition, the soul reading is described as the direct study of the soul mark, and corruption produces marks there that no physical exam and no mental sweep can detect. A licensed psyker, working alongside an Inquisitor, can study those marks to find out what the warrior was contacted by and whether anything still clings to him. For Titus, this should have been the moment the case closed. The marks were either there or they were not, and the Inquisition would know which. Once the test was performed, what came back was not what the investigators were looking for. A clean result would have led to release. A dirty result would have led to execution, and Titus got neither. Silence in the record from that moment forward says more than any verdict would have. Building on those cases, the expanded material of the Horus Heresy storyline documents Astartes who pass initial screenings only to reveal deeper damage years later, which is why a clean answer was not enough. Working from that history, the Ordo treats a clean soul reading not as proof of a clean warrior, but as a flag. Two clean answers in a row from two different methods do not relieve the investigators. Two clean answers in a row tell them they are looking in the wrong place. Inside the Ordo, a clean reading does not end an investigation, it deepens it. Pushing them to the third stage was that same logic, and that final stage is one most subjects do not come back from whole. Memory pulling is more invasive than either of the first two, because it does not read what is already there. It draws specific recollections out of the mind and removes them. The technique is the careful drawing out, and where necessary the removal, of specific memories from a man's recall. Applied to a space marine, the tool becomes far-reaching, because a captain's mind contains hundreds of engagements, dozens of command decisions, and the reasoning behind every order he has ever issued. For someone the first two stages had failed to resolve, that archive was the only place left to look. Every moment Titus had ever spent near the corrupting force was a moment the investigators needed to review. And review meant pulling each one out of him to examine it directly. The process was not a single pull, it was a full walk through a lifetime of service, and that walk took years. By the time it was done, Titus had been through a procedure that breaks most men, and the case was still open. None of the procedures had closed the case, and that meant the next stage of his custody could no longer be measured in weeks or months, but in decades. On Macragge, the Second Company continued without him. New officers took his posts, new brothers swore the oaths he had once sworn, the campaigns rolled on, the wars rolled on, and the chapter kept fighting. The name of the captain who had led on Graia was missing from the list, missing from the after-action reports, and missing from the memorial halls. He was not declared dead, and he was not declared anything. Across the wider galaxy, the Great Rift opened. The Indominus Crusade began. Whole sectors fell to chaos and were retaken at terrible cost. New chapters were founded, old chapters were rebuilt, and the map of the Imperium changed beyond recognition. Through all of it, no official source placed Titus anywhere. The galaxy was being remade, while the man at the center of the story was being slowly disassembled in a place no record could find him. Keeping logs of nearly everything is the Adeptus Administratum, which is the record system of the 41st millennium, including troop movements, tithe shipments, hive-level census data, and even the names of commanders lost on worlds that no longer have inhabitants. Most of those records are incomplete, in conflict, or actively wrong. But they exist because the bureaucracy writes things down. When a record does not exist, it is because someone chose for it not to exist. An empty file within the system is not silence, but a decision. Drawing from the book Codex Inquisition and the expanded material of the book Dark Heresy, the way that decision is recorded goes by several labels, including restricted access, sealed record, and classification at the highest levels. The practical effect is the same in each case. A man whose activities are not allowed to appear in ordinary record keeping has been judged too sensitive for the normal archive, and someone, somewhere, filed a specific order to make him invisible. That is what happened to Titus, and it happened for over a century. Inside the system, there is a difference that matters here. The Inquisition does not seal the records of cases that have been closed. Closed cases are published, and their names are used as warnings, because the point of resolving a matter involving a fallen Astartes is to remind every other chapter of the consequences. Sealed records belong to subjects the Ordo is still using, and Titus was a sealed record. He was not buried, he was not closed, and he was kept. What was being done with him during those years is not laid out directly. The expanded material does cover the set of methods available to the Ordo when someone is held for a long period, and those methods fall into three broad categories. First is memory alteration. The technique is the careful rewriting of specific portions of a man's recall. It is not full erasure, but careful editing, which includes removing certain events, dulling certain associations, and replacing certain conclusions with others that suit the mission. Applied to someone of Titus's profile, memory alteration would be used to remove the exact memories that made him worth investigating in the first place. Practicing this kind of work on Astartes already happens through the Deathwatch, which is why the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Xenos is a rare example of Space Marines serving directly under Inquisitorial command. When a brother finishes his tour of duty with the Deathwatch and returns to his parent chapter, certain memories of his service are restricted or sealed. Specific operational details, the identities of contacts, classified Xenos intelligence, and the names of certain enemies are removed or locked away. The brother goes back to his chapter as a veteran, but as a veteran whose record has been edited at the Ordo's discretion. The practice is documented in the book Deathwatch, and it is treated as standard rather than unusual. The Imperium has been doing this to Astartes for thousands of years. Control over a man's actions is one form of power. Control over his memory is another, and it is the harder one to break. Second is hypnoconditioning, which is a method of training the mind below the level of conscious thought. Older and more widely used across mankind's domain, hypnoconditioning trains in specific beliefs, responses, and loyalties without the warrior knowing the training is happening, and it is standard in the development of new Astartes as well as in the conditioning of sanctioned troops. For a returning veteran, it would be used to rebuild the reflexes that the long custody may have loosened. The third is the most invasive of the three. Across the expanded material, it is referred to under several names, but the meaning is the same throughout. The man is not edited, but rebuilt. Memory, loyalty, instinct, and identity are all examined, adjusted, and in some cases, replaced. The warrior who emerges remembers enough of his prior self to function, but the foundations underneath that memory are not the foundations he was born with. A century is a long time to spend on one man. During that century, the Imperium fought the largest war it had seen in 10,000 years. and through every battle, the file on Titus stayed open. Whatever they were doing with him did not stop, and they did not let him go. Then, after more than a century of silence, he came back, and the man who came back was not the same man who had gone in. A man who has been pulled apart, held in the dark for a century, and put back together by the people who pulled him apart, does not come back as he was. The script of who he is has been rewritten at the edges, even if the core is still recognizable. That is the man the Imperium handed back to the chapter, opening with a version of Titus who is immediately recognizable and immediately different. The game Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 sets the new state right away. The armor is new, the formation is new, and the chapter designation has changed. He is back with the Ultramarines and back in the Second Company, but he is no longer the captain. He is a lieutenant, the man who led the defense of Graia, who refused chaos to its face, and who survived a century of inquisitorial custody, has come back at a lower rank than he held when he was arrested. The Imperium did not explain it, and the chapter did not contest it. A captain in the Adeptus Astartes runs his company the way a chapter master runs his chapter. He answers up the chain, but the daily decisions are his. Inside the book Codex Space Marines, and in the supporting material of the book Ultramarines Supplement, the captain of a company is given direct authority over the deployment, training, and operations of the 100 Astartes under his command. He answers to the chapter master, but in practice, that relationship is a big picture rather than day-to-day. A captain does not ask permission to engage, he decides. He writes his company's combat plans, he selects his veteran sergeants, and he signs off on the tactical priorities of every engagement his formation takes part in. That was Titus on Graia. A lieutenant is something different. Lieutenants exist to carry out the tactical priorities set by the captain, to command specific task groups within the company, and to make sure the captain's plan is followed at the squad level. A lieutenant has authority, but he does not hold authority on his own. Reducing him to that rank, the institution did something specific. It did not bar him from duty, it did not strip him of armor, and it did not pull him from the field. Instead, it kept him in active service at the level where his decisions are always reviewed before they become operational. A captain can be wrong about a major decision and act on it for weeks before anyone above him can step in. A lieutenant cannot, and that is the point. The reduction did not just lower his rank, it took away the one thing his career had been built on, which was the trust to act without being checked. Looked at on its own, the change could be explained in several ordinary ways. Chapter reassignment often comes with a rank adjustment, and reformed chapter structures sometimes require veterans to accept new titles. None of those explanations apply here. However, because a veteran accepting a new chapter structure is usually given a role that reflects his prior seniority, such as a command of an elite detachment, an assignment to a veteran company, or a posting as a senior tactical advisor, and Titus was given none of those. Tied to the game Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, released in 2024, the official Warhammer community articles describe his return in plain language. He is described as returned to service and reassigned to a new posting. What the article does not describe is a restoration. His captaincy was not given back, his prior command was not returned, and the lieutenancy is the outcome of the investigation, not a step back from the position he held during custody. They did not restore Titus, they placed him. That word, placement, matters. The rank change is only the first visible layer of it, and the second layer lives in his body, where the cost was higher than anything the Imperium had taken from him so far. What the Imperium had taken from Titus up to this point was time, memory, and authority. What it was about to ask of him next was his life. Coming back from custody, he did not come back as the Astartes he had been. His body had been changed. He returned as a Primaris Lieutenant, which means his armor, his physiology, and his combat profile were of the newer standard, rather than the older firstborn one he had served under for his entire career. That transition is not routine. It is the result of a procedure known as the Rubicon Primaris. Documented across several official sources, most directly in the novel trilogy Dark Imperium, the Rubicon Primaris is laid out in clear terms. An existing firstborn Astartes, created under the original gene seed standards of the first founding, can undergo a surgical and biological transition to the newer profile developed by the Archmagos biologist Belisarius Cawl. The conversion involves the addition of new organs, the strengthening of existing ones, and the rebuilding of his enhanced body, and the operation has a real fatality rate. The Rubicon Primaris is not a promotion, but a test the warrior can fail in the most permanent way possible. In the expanded material, the fatality rate is described as variable. It depends on the candidate's age, prior injuries, and the quality of the medical care available. For a seasoned veteran, the rate is real, and for a captain with over a century of prior service before his detention, the rate would have been higher still. Survival was not guaranteed. It was a coin flip with his life on the table. Two named Ultramarines officers had already crossed the Rubicon, and their cases are on the record. Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, crossed the Rubicon in the comic series Marneus Calgar, released in 2020. It took place on Macragge, under the care of the full Ultramarines Apothecary Corps. With the highest level of medical support the chapter could provide. He survived, though the surgery nearly killed him. Cato Sicarius, another senior Ultramarines officer, underwent the same conversion, and his case is laid out in the supporting material of the current edition. Sicarius was a veteran of multiple Imperial campaigns, and his crossing was performed under chapter supervision with full formal context. Titus did not have any of that. Both Calgar and Sicarius crossed the Rubicon as respected officers in good standing, inside their own chapter, attended by their own apothecaries, and under conditions designed to give them the best chance of survival. Titus crossed it after over a century of inquisitorial custody, with no clear standing in his chapter at the time of his crossing, and the conditions of his recovery and monitoring are not on record anywhere in the canon. His own crossing happened at the point in his history when the state had the most to lose if he died, and clearance was granted anyway. Looking at the procedure's known profile, that decision can be understood not as a choice to strengthen him, but as a choice to see whether he would survive being put through it. Applying standard inquisitorial practice, the logic is consistent. Any outcome would resolve the problem the Ordo had been holding. A warrior who does not survive ends the file with a recognized chapter right, honored without public trouble. A warrior who survives provides something else, because the apothecary's examinations during and after the transition give any attached observers direct access to his body, his gene seed condition, and the state of every enhanced organ he carries, and any remaining biological question about corruption is answered by the surgery itself. Looked at this way, the Rubicon Primaris resolves the case either way. There is a second result of the conversion, one that has nothing to do with survival. Primaris Astartes fit more cleanly into the reformed chapter structures than firstborn veterans do, and the reason is cultural as much as biological. A firstborn officer carries his own memory of the Brotherhood as it existed before the reforms, and that memory can be a form of loyalty. It can also be a form of quiet resistance to the New Order, however, and the conversion removed that wild card at the biological level. It shifted his profile into the standard around which the current hierarchy is organized. His body had been changed to fit the system the Imperium had been rebuilding while he was gone, and the system was waiting for him. He had survived the procedure, but the world he was about to walk into was not the one he remembered, and his last form of independence was about to be taken from him too. Surviving custody, the procedures, and the Rubicon left Titus with one thing intact. The one thing left to him was his command style, the way he had run his company before his arrest. That was about to be taken away. 10,000 years before Titus was taken into custody, Rebude Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, and one of the 20 genetically engineered sons of the Emperor, had been struck down by his fallen brother and placed in stasis on Macragge. He was held there in a state of slow death, his wounds preserved by the technology of his own chapter, while the Imperium he had helped build drifted for 10,000 years without him. During the years Titus was in custody, that stasis ended. Guilliman was revived. His wounds were closed. He stood up, walked out of the chamber where his chapter had kept him, and resumed active command of the war effort. The Imperium that took Titus into custody no longer existed by the time he came back. That event is documented across the campaign series Gathering Storm, released in 2017, and the Indominus Crusade campaign material. Titus came back into a state that had been remade by his own Primarch. The Inquisition was watching him from behind, and the Primarch was now watching him from above. Guilliman's governing philosophy, laid out in the novel Dark Imperium, is organized around three principles: restoration of the Codex Astartes, rebuilding of the military into predictable and trackable structures, return of stability to an institution that had drifted for 10,000 years. Every one of those principles applied directly to Titus. Reforms restored much of the original discipline that had faded during the Primarch's absence. Officer roles were set to a single standard. Chapter structures were brought back into line with the original template, and tactical doctrines were reviewed, written down, and put under formal oversight at levels that did not exist before his return. That was the system Titus was released into, and for an ordinary officer, it would have been an adjustment. For Titus, it was a vice. His command style was the reason. In his original captaincy, he had been an officer who relied on personal judgment rather than following the rulebook. The commands he issued on Graia, the quick decisions that held the facility, and the tactical reversals that turned the engagement were all personal, and they all worked. By the strict standards of the original Codex, however, many of those decisions would not have passed formal review. Following written tactical doctrines is what the new officer corps is expected to do, and every decision is expected to be traceable to the rulebook under which it was made. A captain making the Graia calls today would be in the review queue within the standard reporting cycle. He did not receive that review in his original command because he was the captain. He receives it now because he is not. In the old order, Titus was effective. In Guilliman's order, he is a wild card. That phrase is not decoration. In plain terms, a wild card is a factor the rulebook cannot remove without breaking how it was meant to work. The system can measure him, limit him, and within limits, predict him. What it cannot do is ignore him, because an officer who consistently operates outside the rulebook is exactly the kind of factor the new system was built to control. For Guilliman, who is rebuilding the Imperium to reduce that kind of unpredictability, Titus is a problem that requires specific handling. The handling is not discipline, but placement. The lieutenant rank is one element of it. The reformed chapter hierarchy is another, and an assignment to engagements where his decisions are checked by more senior officers is a third, and he has been put into all three. The man who once made his own calls now makes calls under review, and the freedom that had defined his career was the last thing he had left to lose. Returning to active service, Titus was given a deployment that was not a quiet one. In the campaign of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, he is sent against Tyranid forces, and beneath that threat, he encounters chaos elements aligned with the Thousand Suns. The mission profile rises through the campaign, and the threats he faces grow. The Imperium does not send a cleared man back to fight the same enemy that broke his file the first time. It sends him somewhere else, with someone else's command. Titus was sent to the same enemy under his old chapter. Inside the book Deathwatch, a specific category of service is described that fits this pattern. Warriors whose long-term loyalty is uncertain are sometimes assigned to units with extra supervision, and their postings are chosen to put them in conditions that will reveal whatever the investigation could not determine through ordinary means. A man who will eventually fall is expected to fall faster under pressure. A man who will not fall is expected to keep resisting, and each resistance event produces additional information. He is not being watched directly, he's being watched through the environment around him. Officers around Titus, his chapter command structure, his immediate superior, the veterans in his unit, and the apothecary responsible for his post-Rubicon body are all, in one form or another, part of the observation system. The reporting structure of a reformed Ultramarines company provides regular formal reviews of every officer by those above him, and for someone in his position, those evaluations function as regular reports on an ongoing study. There is also one face among them that Titus knows. Leandros, the brother who reported him a century ago, is still alive, still in the chapter, and still serving alongside him. Assigned to the same company, the man whose Codex doctrine started the entire investigation is now a fellow officer in his unit, and whether that arrangement is coincidence or design, the canon does not say. Across the campaign of the second title, Titus is exposed to chaos again. He fights Tyranids, he fights Thousand Suns, and he encounters the corrupting force in multiple forms. Every contact produces new data, every action is logged, and every decision he makes lands on someone's desk. He is also, at every point, given the chance to fall, and he does not fall. He is one miscalculation from a different outcome, and he does not appear to have been told. Living under continuing review, a man does not have the same margin for error that an ordinary Astartes has. The ordinary warrior is expected to win, and if he falls in battle, he is honored, committed to rest, and replaced. Someone under review is expected to confirm his standing, and if his conduct produces any clear evidence of being broken, such as a questionable decision under pressure, an unusual pattern of tactical choices, or a hesitation at the wrong moment, the case moves from observation to resolution. Several outcomes are available to an Inquisitor running a long-term examination. Continued observation is one, recall and re-examination is another, and reposting is a third. The final option, used when the warrior's behavior crosses whatever line the Inquisitor has set, is closure, which means the formal end of his service. Titus has been put exactly close enough to that line for the data to keep coming, and he has not been told. A man informed of his watch conditions would change his behavior to meet them, and that change would ruin the results. The state cannot tell him what is being measured without destroying the measurement, so he has to keep acting as though his situation were ordinary, because the moment he acts otherwise, the Ordo will know he knows, and the file will close. By the time Titus has fought through the campaign of the second title, the arrest, the missing century, the rank reduction, the Rubicon, the chapter assignment, and the deployment have all fallen into a single shape. None of the components is unusual by itself. The Inquisition performs all of them regularly, in many different contexts, on many different warriors. What is unusual is the full combination applied to one named officer over more than a century of service. The combination is the signature of a specific kind of operation, which is a long-term examination of a man whose standing cannot be resolved through ordinary means. The Imperium is not trying to decide whether Titus is loyal. That matter was settled long ago, at least for now. What it is trying to decide is what kind of case he is, because the concern is not about his conduct, but about his nature. By the established corruption pattern, an Astartes under continued pressure is almost always broken in some visible way, either through the changes the book Codex Chaos Space Marines documents, or through the smaller shifts in behavior the investigators track. Titus has been contacted more times than almost any other named Astartes in the current canon, and he has not been corrupted. That is not an ordinary profile, but a one-of-a-kind case. Corruption in the canon is gradual, but reliable, and he has been contacted repeatedly, yet he has not been corrupted. Concerns about him have not been addressed in public, but the pattern of the Imperium's actions makes them visible. First is biological. There may be something different about his gene seed, which is the genetic template from which a Space Marine is created. The apothecary has not released any findings on that point, and the silence is itself revealing. Second is psychological. There may be something in his conditioning, his training, or his formative years that produced a resistance stronger than the standard profile. The memory procedures used during his custody, if they were used, would make that kind of assessment harder, not easier. Third concerns the official doctrine of the Creed, and it is the most dangerous of the three. In the Imperial Creed, resistance to the corrupting force is understood as a gift from the Emperor, whose psychic presence is believed to shield loyal souls from the worst effects of the Immaterium. A warrior who resists unusually well may therefore be seen, by certain factions, as having been chosen, and that view attracts attention. It draws interest from the ecclesiarchy, which is the state church, from the Ordo Hereticus, and from political factions within the wider state who would like to claim such a warrior for their own purposes. A man who becomes a prize that other factions compete to own is a man the Inquisition has to keep close, and that is what they did to Titus. He was not a soldier who was cleared, he is a soldier who is kept. What is being studied through him is a forbidden question. The question is whether an Astartes can resist the corrupting force permanently, or whether corruption is unavoidable. It is forbidden because the Imperial Creed has already answered it. To reopen the matter, even in private, is to admit that the official answer might be wrong, and admitting that the official answer might be wrong would force the Imperium to reconsider a large set of beliefs, institutions, and ways of doing things that have been built on it for 10,000 years. In public, the Imperium will not make that admission, but the Ordo will examine it in private. Its role inside the state includes the study of matters the rest of the state cannot afford to engage with directly, and Titus is one of those matters. He is still in the field. He fights on, the way he always has. He commands the brothers under him, carries out the doctrines set above him, and answers to officers he barely knows. By any reasonable measure, Titus is stronger than he has ever been. His body has been reinforced, his armor is of the most current pattern, and his experience covers more than a century of service. By the same measure, however, he is also completely cut off. Serving in a formation that is not the one he was taken from, he sees most of the officers around him are not the officers he served with on Graia. Sidonius is dead, and the brothers he fought beside in the original campaign are gone, fallen, retired, or scattered across engagements whose records are not available to him. The continuity of relationships an ordinary warrior relies on has been broken for him and not rebuilt. He is the most capable version of himself he has ever been, yet he has the smallest personal network he has ever had. That cut-off state was not built on purpose. The Inquisition did not have to cut him off deliberately, because time did that on its own. By the time he came back, the officers who knew him as a captain were gone. The second company he had led had been rebuilt under different commanders, and the chapter itself had been reformed. And ordinary years had already done what any special isolation operation would have attempted. The result is a warrior whose decisions in the field are as close to traceable to one man as the wider state can reasonably make them. He carries no deep personal loyalties that might color a report, no long-running tactical partnerships with specific sergeants, and no command routines built over decades in a single unit. Every decision he makes is visible, and every decision he makes is his. His position has no good exit. If he falls to the corrupting force, he proves the Imperial creed correct, and his name becomes an entry in the long record of warriors who resisted longer than most. If he does not fall, the outcome is in some ways worse for him personally, because a warrior who resists permanently becomes a warrior the leadership does not know how to label, and a category the state cannot name is a category the state cannot trust. The reflex of the system is to remove rare cases it cannot absorb. Win or lose, the state wins, and Titus does not. No source has said what the wider state does with an Astartes who stops behaving like one, and the primary canon does not provide an answer. He is still in active service. The record is still being written, and the study being run through him is still unresolved. So Titus fights on. The Ordo watches. The Primarch watches, and Leandros watches from the squad next to his. Around him, the system keeps generating data, and the question the Imperium is studying through him remains, for now, open. But Titus is not the only figure whose record the state keeps under careful control. Rebude Gilliman, the Primarch whose reforms now hold him in place, carries a record of his own that is just as complicated. So does Cyphus Cain, another servant of the Creed mistaken in the opposite direction.